Ouch! Oh, hi. Wait a minute.
How do you paint splash art?
I don't know.
Fear not, my friend. Today I'll be sharing with you how to do just that. Welcome back. In this video, I'll be sharing with you the second half of my process in making the splash. I'll be going over things like how to render any material, photo bashing techniques, post-processing, adjustment layers, all the fun stuff. If you haven't already, you can find the first part of the video in the description where I go over all the fundamental stuff you need to know to have a solid foundation before you can get to this point. Also, I just wanted to say I'm very happy that you guys found a lot of value out of my content, and also I do appreciate all the kind words to those who reached out. Anyways, it seems like most of you are pretty interested in material rendering, so let's get that out of the way first. I like to think of materials as three main components: reflectivity, transparency, and texture. Reflectivity tells us about the surface's ability to bounce light. Transparency tells us about how much light is penetrating the surface of the object, and texture tells us about the surface quality. Now let's break down each component even further, starting with reflectivity. Reflectivity is like a spectrum. On one hand, we have no reflectivity at all, like a matte object basically, and then on the other, we have a completely chrome surface, like a mirror. The only difference being how much each material is being affected by environmental colors and lights. As we go from most reflective to no reflectivity at all, the object gradually loses its ability to reflect, therefore retaining more of its initial colors and values. Generally speaking, the more reflective an object is, the wider of a value range it can have depending on environmental factors, whereas matte objects are a lot more simple to deal with. They aren't as affected by environmental lights or colors, which means they have a tighter value range and you just have to worry about the object's local colors. Something that's matte like dry wood or skin will retain most of its color and at most be somewhat affected by the light around it, while something that's more reflective like polished metals or a glass mirror will be way more affected by its surroundings, so much so that you won't even be able to tell what its local colors are anymore, because it's just fully taking on the light of its surroundings. Objects can also change in reflectivity when being glazed. What do I mean by this? Well, when there's a translucent or transparent material like water or polish on top of an object, that object will now inherit a lot of its reflective properties. For example, wood itself is not naturally reflective, but once you add a polish on top of it, it can be just as reflective as a metal. It's just something to keep in mind as well when it comes to reflectivity. But speaking of transparency, transparency dictates how much light can be passed through the surface of a material. Something like glass or water pretty much lets all light pass through, while something like cloth or skin lets only a portion of light through. So when painting something like cloth or skin, you'll tend to see heavily saturated areas due to the penetrated light bouncing around inside the object before being received by our eyes. Since light takes on a little of the color of whatever object it bounces off of, when light hits skin and bounces around underneath it due to its translucent surface, it will come out the other side as a saturated reddish orange from all the blood vessels underneath the skin. We call this subsurface scattering. Common examples of this can be found on the Terminator line when being hit by a strong direct light, or on thinner parts of the body like the fingers or ears where light can pass through more easily. I'm getting off topic, but besides those examples, transparent materials aren't that prevalent in my experience, so don't think it's something you need to worry about too much. Just some things to keep in mind. And finally, textures is just the patterns we commonly see on materials. It can tell us the roughness, thickness, and even age of the material. Whether it's the little bumps, divots, and scratches in metals, stripes on wood, or the woven patterns of clothing. If you want to render materials, you need to be able to analyze these patterns and learn to replicate them. While I can't teach you immediately how to imitate every single pattern of texture, you can easily imitate most of them using a few methods. The first method is hand painting it. The most tried and true method, you can usually just paint it when it's not a highly geometrical repetitive pattern. Usually objects with more organic patterns like wood, scratched up metals, or patches of grass. Honestly, you're just gonna have to get some reference, or you can do some studies beforehand to better understand them. for the sake of explaining it, I'll do a few demos to better show you what I mean. I'm going to start off by rendering the basic forms while making sure to keep in mind the reflectivity like I mentioned earlier. The light source isn't too important as long as I keep things consistent. And once we have the forms in check, we can start adding the texture. For this metal object, I can add some dents and scratches to show that it's been worn down over time. I could also add more intentionally designed patterns in the metal with these divots. For example, a common pattern I see in metal design language is having a parallel divot lining the silhouette. But there are so many options to choose from. For example, cyberpunk and project skin themes tend to have these diagonal divots, while Demacian metalwork tends to have more symmetrical curve-concurve designs. Alright, for the next one, I decided to do a simple wooden plank just to demonstrate some more common materials. So wooden planks are quite simple. It's quite literally just curvy grooves going in the direction of the wood. You can vary these grooves sometimes with circular patterns, and if you're stuck, just find reference. Like before, you can also add scratch marks like how I did with the metal earlier to indicate how worn out it is. All in all, it's pretty simple. It's all about noticing these textural patterns and form changes and then trying to implement them. Anyways, that's my mini guide for hand painting textures. But what do we do when facing patterns that are more geometrical and repetitive in nature, like these textures for example? This is where we go for option B. Now option B to implement texture is to photobash it. Especially when it comes to complex armor or clothing patterns like these, they're just really hard to paint convincingly without wasting a huge amount of time and effort. Photobashing can be a quick and easy method to get that texture if you know how to do it correctly. There are 3 steps to doing it. Step 1. Having the right underlying form before starting is crucial. If you photobash it well, but the underlying form is blurry or roughly defined, the final result will still look unconvincing. It's like the equivalent of adding icing on a deformed cake. Step 2. Warp the texture to the form. For this step, it's really simple. You want to find a texture that fits that material. For example, I'll be using this texture here. An easy Google search can help you find any texture. I'll change the layer into overlay, lower the opacity, and then hit Ctrl T, right click, and select warp. Now when you're warping it to the form, it doesn't have to be accurate to a T, but as long as it feels like it's wrapping around the form, then you should be good. If there's a huge plane change on the form, you can duplicate the layer and then warp that new texture layer onto the other plane. Finally, to actually sell the believability, step 3 is to adjust the values of the texture so it feels more natural. I typically use curves to adjust the values, but you could also use the levels adjustment layer or the sliders and blending options. Either way, the goal here is to make the texture feel real. Let's take a real-life example of how textures can be affected by light. Notice how most of the texturing can be seen in this area, between the highlight and the shadow, aka the midtone area. What texture is at its foundation is a pattern of tiny bumps and divots in a given surface. These divots are small changes in the form that are big enough to receive value changes from lighting. For example, a scratch on the surface of this metal, if zoomed in, it would look like this. But a series of them in a smaller scale could translate into this. The reason why most of the texture is seen in the midtone area is because it's in those transitional areas where darker and lighter tones stand out from the midtone value, thus being more noticeable. Now in the shadow and highlight areas, you usually want to have less textures because there's less opportunities for those values to receive enough contrast to be noticeable. Okay, cool. Now we know where the texture is commonly seen, but how do we translate that into our photo bashing? It's simple really. All you have to do is lower the contrast in textures in those extremely dark and light areas. My favorite way of doing this is by making a mask by clicking here. Essentially how a mask works is any area painted white will be fully visible, while the darker the value gets, the more erased the pixels on that layer will be, until you paint it fully black, in which case nothing in that painted area will be visible. So if I fill in the mask to be completely black, the layer will be no longer visible. That being said, you want the layer to be fully white when you're doing this, and while selecting black, subtly erase out where you don't want the texture to be. Now you'll notice that the texture looks too sharp and realistic. We want the texture to blend in with the painting seamlessly. So what I like to do is blur out the texture with either a subtle Gaussian blur or motion blur. And essentially that's how you photo bash without making it look too unnatural. Let's summarize what we've learned so far. Materials can be broken down into 3 main components: reflectivity, transparency, and texture. Reflectivity is a spectrum going from matte all the way to chrome objects, and depending on the reflectivity, an object can be affected by light more or less. Transparency tells us about how much light can be passed through a given surface, subsurface scattering being the main example we commonly see. And texture is the divots and patterns we see on a given surface that tells us about the surface quality. We can implement them in 2 main ways: hand painting them through observation and through photo bashing. Now let's talk about the triple Ds. Nuts? The idea behind this concept is you want to be selective about where you add all your details. A common mistake is when artists try to show off their rendering every opportunity they get. It's not always about having beautiful rendering everywhere. Too much detail can leave the viewers feeling visually overwhelmed. The opposite can also be true. When there's too much lack of detail in certain areas, it can leave the piece feeling unfinished. Espen Lash talked about this concept at one point about his Zaya and Rakan splash. He talked about alternating between areas of rest and detail, as shown. I personally haven't discovered any solid rules around it. I mainly go by intuition, but it's good to keep the concept in mind. You can also use it as a framing device. For example, if the focal point is the face, which often tends to be the case when it comes to character illustrations, you can keep the areas around the face simpler and go ham with the detailing on the face itself, so it seems even more rendered relative to its surroundings. The opposite can also be true. If there are lots of surrounding detail, creating an area of rest can be an easy way to accentuate a focal point. It's a discipline to control where you add your detail. Having a good balance and also using it as a means to create focal points to lead the viewer's eyes. Now that was a lot of theory. Anyways, here's the rest of the time lapse where I'll share some of the struggles I had to go through, my thought process during the entire thing, and some general tips and advice. And near the end, I'll share my updated post-processing with y'all and some other tips. So over here, I'm painting the VFX, and typically how you want to approach painting VFX is the closer it gets to the brightest areas, you want to make desaturated but very bright, and as soon as it tapers off, use darker and more saturated colors to accentuate the highlight. And essentially what this does is it makes the highlight seem even brighter relatively speaking because of the darker values surrounding it. And for the VFX, I'm mainly going for a more graphical read. So I'm using hard edges and just trying to find an appealing shape. Obviously, as most of you can tell, this is heavily inspired by Soul Fighter VFX. But another reason why I thought of adding the VFX over here is to add more rhythm to the piece. The VFX amplify Kane's swinging scythe motion and also creates this sort of frame around Kane's face. So once again, we're using that to draw in the viewer's eyes. And ultimately, the entire circle that the VFX motion is making is pointing back at our main character. As you can see here, I'm repainting the pants. Like I said in the previous video, the way the pants sat on his leg just didn't sit right with me. I had three main issues with it. 1, too many folds made it feel a little unnatural. 2, they were evenly placed apart from each other. And 3, didn't feel like they were fitting on his leg properly. It really sucks when you run into an issue like this after you've invested so much time to render a certain area, but I made the hard decision to completely restart and attempt on a fresh base. It's important to acknowledge you need to start from scratch rather than making minor fixes in an area that will never really address the root cause. It's a tough pill to swallow, but you gotta do it. It's kinda like hard forcing a comp in TFT that just isn't working. You either have to pivot or find a new comp fast or you'll lose. In this case, we'll be losing our valuable time and energy. I obviously still kept an older version of the layer though, just in case I couldn't come up with a better solution at the time. I'm currently blocking in the background assets, which I should have addressed in the thumbnailing stage, but I was too focused on rendering the character and got lazy. Because of the disparity in render quality, not only do I need to catch up the background, but also because it wasn't properly planned out in the thumbnailing stage, it could fuck around with the comp, which means I need to reevaluate whatever areas the background changes have affected. Luckily, especially if you're going for something like a splash art that isn't too narratively rich, you can get away with having a super simple background. So I applied some very basic value changes to push out the silhouette and got away with it. Now, I'm being very particular about the way I paint the structure of the shoe, even though I know I'll probably lower the contrast in the end, just because it's not an area of importance. But the reason I'm putting so much effort into it anyways is because when you do professional illustration, you're required to paint out all of the assets even if they'll be covered by something. The reason is so that they can use the assets freely in other ways if they so chose. But it's just a good practice to not be lazy and treat it like a challenge for yourself, to understand the form. Besides photorealism art, I would say splash art has one of the biggest standards in terms of reaching a high fidelity illustration. There are just so many areas you need to render, and I, like most people, get overwhelmed when I'm trying to complete one. I mean, professionals are given a whole month to a month and a half to finish one, so in order to manage the quality of your painting without feeling overwhelmed, I find at least, is to separate each area into smaller sections or tasks for yourself. For example, I would say the face, the chest, the arm sleeve, and the hand, and then today my task would just be to render out the chest and the face. And so when we separate a grand task like this into smaller digestible tasks, we can avoid burnout and achieve our goals step by step. And even though I say professional splash artists take 1 to 1.5 months, if you're new to this, you shouldn't hold yourself to the same standard. You should be focusing on how to reach that quality threshold first, and then maximize your efficiency from there. Because if you can't reach the quality anyways, and you give yourself a deadline, who's to say how good the illustration quality can be? Take your time and be patient with it, and from my experience, each attempt that I've ever made was better than the last. But none of them were good at the start or good enough to be called a splash art in my opinion. But the key point being, I improved through each experience and learned a bunch of lessons along the way that helped me to get where I am. And even this piece taught me so much that I can apply to my next painting. The reason I'm saying all this is because I don't want anyone to develop unhealthy expectations thinking they should be able to finish a perfect splash within a month. It's definitely a learning process that takes time, and I think as long as you take things step by step, slow and steady will always win the race. As you can see, I'm adding detailed designs like engravings on his jacket collar or the designs on his metal pieces. And as an illustrator, you'll often be given assets that are super simplified 3D models as reference that don't really look good. And your job as an illustrator is to know where and how to add your own detailed designs to make the asset feel more polished and visually appealing. Like I mentioned in the last video, the pant area was one of my biggest hurdles. Right now I'm trying to apply new textures onto the pants just to see what works. And for a long time I couldn't figure it out, which bothered me a lot. But with enough trial and error, I made it work eventually. After that, I started working on the reflection. The only thing I learned about them was that the distance between the point in space of the reflection and the object should be equal. But it was actually a lot harder to figure out than I thought. It still isn't 100% accurate to how the reflection is supposed to be, but it was enough to sell a reflection, and that's all that mattered to me at the time. I'm starting to refine the lasers. Before, I just put them down as super saturated red lines as placeholders. The reference I had was from a Mr. Beast video that showed me that lasers realistically in a dark room were too saturated and would take too much attention away from our main focal points. So I did some digging and found a splash done by Jennifer. The Samira splash also uses lasers, but the saturation and values were significantly reduced, so I kind of stole her solution here. No point in reinventing the wheel. I also noticed she added some air particles to the lasers that were in the foreground area to show that the light of the lasers hit some dust particles. So that's something I added as well. Problem solving is nice, but you can also learn from how other people have already problem solved the issues you're dealing with and steal it. When I began working on the scythe, I wasn't a huge fan of the design. It was a little too jagged and artificial for my taste. And since this is fan art, I'm not technically obligated to follow the model one for one, so I attempted to redesign his scythe to see whether or not I could make it look better. It turned out okay, in my opinion, but it's not the main focus, and it was blurred out a little later on anyways, so it probably didn't matter that much at the end of the day. Even though I said I didn't really enjoy the design, I still wanted to stay true to the design language, so my main goal here was just to add some similar shape language that looked just a little better. At this point, most of the areas on the character are pretty rendered, so I start pushing out the background a little more and add VFX like smoke. And if you're curious how I did it, you don't need a special brush, just use airbrush and then carve out small smoke-like shapes in the bigger shape and you should be good. Anyways, I think somewhere around here is where I tried playing around with the history tab and then lost like 4 days of progress, which really demotivated me because I had to re-render all those areas that I did in the past 4 days. So I lost a lot of momentum and I was molding really hard. This is the point where I find a more suitable texture to photo bash onto his pants. I wanted to imitate a slightly more reflective pattern, like on the Ari reference made by Sasa in the time lapse. I realized a little later on that there were so many different plane changes because of the folds on his pants, which meant that I had to duplicate and photo bash each plane individually, which was honestly really annoying. I also had to significantly reduce the values and opacity just so the texture wasn't overpowering to the point where it would start competing for attention with the face. And after photo bashing, like I mentioned in the demo, I blurred it a little to reduce the sharpness and to make it feel less like a photo. And also I hand painted in certain areas that needed it. Actually, this is the point where I lost the 4 days of progress I mentioned earlier. And so all the texture and facial changes that I made were gone, along with some random other areas. So what ended up happening was I had to take a screenshot from my recording and then essentially play Where's Waldo with trying to identify the differences and then adding them back. Even though it was really annoying, it forced me to reapply the textures to his pants, and I was way more efficient with it the second time around, but also I think it came out way better. So I guess you could say it was a blessing in disguise. We're almost coming to a closing. In the last bit, I start experimenting with these graphical VFX that are both seen in his splash and in the music video. I focused on not putting them on the same horizontal levels and also varying them in size, shape, and proximity to enhance a sense of depth. I also keep in mind not to have them compete with Kane's face too hard and rather use them as a way to support the main focal point. I decided to add some pillars as a way of enhancing depth, but also adding repetition to the environment so it doesn't look too plain. I use this perspective trick to accurately figure out the position of each pillar when they are equidistant from each other. Oh, what? You thought we were done? Let's end this off by talking about the last 10% of a splash. By this point, you're probably exhausted from finishing all that rendering and cleaning up, but this is the last stretch. Putting all your remaining energy into this last bit can take your piece from a 75 to 80% all the way to a 90-95%. My post-processing has changed quite a bit since the last video from 2 years ago, and it can be summed up in doing two main things: adding VFX and particle effects to enhance the atmosphere, and harmonizing, adjusting the overall contrast, colors, and values in the image. Now, why is post-processing special, and why can't we just do these things during the process? The way I like to explain it is, it's the same as why people don't add sprinkles onto a cupcake before it's finished, because it's a topping that adds a little flair to an already complete image. And in all honesty, I don't think it's that important unless you want to make your illustration for a portfolio piece. Because when it comes to just art for yourself or fan art, it's really up to you when you want to call it finished. And also, some art can be quite charming regardless of whether or not you do these things. But if you're trying to get a portfolio piece to get noticed and try hard, post-processing is the way to go. Anyways, let's continue. So let's talk about each part of my post-processing individually, starting with adding particle effects. Adding particle effects are a simple and easy way to enhance the feeling of the atmosphere subtly. The most common particles you would see would be like adding snow, rain, sparks, debris, or dust particles. And to add them, I would usually either just paint them by hand and blur them a little, but I also know some people who just photobash or use a scatter brush and then blur it. Either way works. Just make sure the particle effects aren't evenly spaced, evenly shaped, and evenly grouped, just so it doesn't look like a man-made pattern and more natural. But also remember not to let the particle effects get too noisy or contrasty to the point where it makes the image look worse. Another type of particle effect you can consider is adding foreground dust particles. And this might be a little more different from other particles because they're really close to the camera. These foreground dust particles should look something like this, and the closer the particle is, the bigger it should be and the more blurred, but the further away it is, the sharper and smaller in size it should be. So make sure to add variety in proximity, overlap, and spacing, and you want to keep it very subtle. While most people won't be noticing or looking at these circles, you must not make them too noticeable, It's more about the feeling that it brings, and its job is to enhance the feeling of the atmosphere of your scene. Now on to adjusting colors and values. This is probably one of the most low effort steps there is that can improve your image dramatically, so pay attention. Firstly, when you have your finished painting ready, flatten it out all into one layer by hitting Ctrl-Shift-Alt-E all at the same time while selecting a new layer. This will basically flatten everything onto one new layer, so that any of the changes we make we can go back on, and also compare it to our previous versions to mask out any areas that we didn't like. And what we're going to do here is go to Filter and click Raw Camera Filter. Next, you'll see a bunch of settings you can play with. These settings are pretty much your adjustment layers all in one place, where you can adjust everything from the hue, temperature, value, contrast, all the way to sharpness, adding noise, or noise reduction. This really requires a good understanding of values, colors, and just an overall good eye for what your piece needs. So if you use the tool poorly, it could make your image look a lot worse. And also, your image might not even need this step. So don't change these settings just for the sake of changing it. Do it only if you know that it will make your image look better, which we can test by tampering with the settings and going back and forth between the previous versions to see which one we like more. So I'll go briefly over each setting and how I like to play with them. So under lighting, all of these sliders will be affecting your values. It's pretty much like the levels or curves adjustment layers. The thing I would keep an eye out for here is whether or not the focal point, aka the places we want our viewers to look first, have enough contrast, and if certain areas in the background are competing with the focal points by having too much contrast. If your overall image is looking too dark or bright, you can also play with the exposure slider. I usually just like to adjust the contrast. Make sure you don't go too overboard with this. You want to slightly push out the focal point, and you can tell if you're adding too much contrast when the darks start to become straight up black. So after tampering with only the values, I'm going to hit OK and apply the effects, and then mask out where I don't want the contrast I added to be, which, like I explained, is usually on the edge of the canvas or wherever the focal point is not. Next, let's go back to the raw camera filter again. So under color, these sliders are pretty self-explanatory. Temperature is for making the image warmer or cooler. Tint, vibrance, saturation, you can all just play around with them. And so under effects mainly change the sharpness and noise in your image, which can be quite impactful. So for the texture slider, the less texture there is, the more smoothened out all the noisy details will be. And if you slide it to the right, it will sharpen them all more and more. Next, the clarity slider sharpens all the contrast on the silhouettes. Dehaze affects the color contrast. Vignette adds a border around the edges, and I like to use this mainly to draw the viewer's eyes further into the center of the image, which is typically where the focal points are. But you don't have to use these sliders. You can just paint it manually with an airbrush, which is what I usually do. And finally, grain is the same as the add noise effect, where it adds these tiny particles that create a texture to make your painting feel less digitally made. Now the curves here is just another way to play with values, but we already did them with the levels sliders, so it's really up to you which ones you want to change. It's just a different tool to achieve the same results, but I think curves can be a lot more flexible. Color Mixer is a tool that allows us to select a specific color and slightly adjust it towards a similar but different hue. Now color grading is one of my favorite tools. It's essentially just the color balance adjustment layer. I typically like to use this to enhance the temperature of the shadows and lights. I find that when I enhance the light to be warmer or cooler and then do the opposite temperature with the shadow, it tends to enhance the mood, as the warms are warmer and the cools are cooler. And the lighting will also just feel more unified. You can try different variations, but something I notice is that you shouldn't go too crazy, especially in the shadow areas, and especially if you change the color to blue. These changes need to be quite subtle, or they can make or break your image. Now the detail sliders are very similar to the effects panels we talked about earlier, so I'm not really going to go over them. The ones I covered are pretty much the most important ones. So now that we have the changes, we want to hit apply and then go back and forth between the previous and current version to see what we like and mask out the areas you want to see the changes have an effect in. And one last final bit, I want to cover adding blurs. And keep in mind, this is a super situational thing, but when it comes to dynamic illustrations, you can use motion blur, Gaussian blur, and radial blur depending on the motion, and it can bring a lot more impact to your image. Similar to the raw camera filter from earlier, we want to hit Ctrl-Shift-Alt-E to be able to mask out any areas we don't want the blur to affect later on. So for motion blur, you want to just go to filter, blur, and then motion blur. Choose the intensity of the blur on the slider, and then direction by rotating in the circle. Gaussian blur is more simple. It's under filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and it just softens everything out, no particular direction. The slider is for the intensity of the blur, and I typically use this on any foreground elements that's super close to the camera. And then for radial blur, you typically want to use this in a more one-point perspective shot where something's coming towards the camera at high velocity. So this cane piece would be a great example since he's heading towards the camera. You can find this filter under blur, radial blur, and then you want to select zoom. And how it works is wherever this dot is, the areas closest to it will be blurred the least, and the areas further and further away will be motion blurred towards the dot gradually more and more the further away it is from the center point. And so when we apply these effects, you want to either make the center dot close to the face or to a point that's closest to the camera proximity wise, and erase out any of the focal areas the blur is affecting too much. Remember, these effects are all situational, so do not use them just for the sake of using them. But yeah, that's pretty much all I do for post-processing. Congratulations on completing a splash art. I hope after all this you were able to apply everything I've shared with you, and if you did follow this guide, I'd love to see your final results in the comments. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed watching just as much as I enjoyed editing, because I certainly had a lot of fun. I can't say when my next upload will be, just because there's a lot of things in my life I need to get figured out right now, but I will say I have a lot of cool ideas in store. So if you want to stay updated with me, feel free to follow me on my socials. And if you have any topics or subjects you want me to talk about, or any tutorial ideas, feel free to comment them down below and I'll consider them. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I hopefully will see you within the next 2 years.